CNN has learned that the nation's top intelligence officials provided information to President-elect Donald Trump and to President Barack Obama last week about claims of Russian efforts to compromise President-elect Trump. The information was provided as part of last week's classified intelligence briefings regarding Russian efforts to undermine the U.S. elections. I've been working on this story with Jim Sciutto and Evan Perez and Carl Bernstein. We've all been working on this, and they all join me now. So let me start with my colleague, Jim Sciutto. Jim, walk us through what we've learned.
I want to be very precise here. Multiple U.S. officials with direct knowledge of the briefings tell CNN that classified documents on Russian interference in the 2016 U.S. election presented last week to President Obama and to President-elect Trump included allegations that Russian operatives claimed to have compromising personal and financial information about Mr. Trump. The allegations were part of a two-page synopsis. These were based on memos compiled by a former British intelligence operative whose past work U.S. intelligence officials consider credible. The FBI is now investigating the credibility and accuracy of the allegations, which are based primarily on information from Russian sources, but the FBI has not confirmed many essential details in the memos about Mr. Trump. The classified briefings last week, I should note, were presented by four of the senior-most U.S. intelligence chiefs. That is, Director of National Intelligence James Clapper, FBI Director James Comey, the CIA Director John Brennan, and NSA Director Admiral Mike Rogers. This two-page synopsis also included allegations that there was a continuing exchange of information during the campaign between Trump surrogates and intermediaries for the Russian government. This, according to two national security officials. CNN has confirmed that the synopsis was included in the documents that were presented to Mr. Trump. However, we cannot confirm if it was discussed in his meeting with those intelligence chiefs. The Trump transition team declined to comment. I should also mention that the Office of the Director of National Intelligence and the FBI also declined to comment as well.
Now, we should point out that we did reach out to the Trump team. They say that they are working on a statement. They will get back to us. As soon as they do get back to us, we will provide that information in our online reporting and also on television. I just want to underline this two-page synopsis that we're referring to. This is an annex. This is an addendum to the intelligence community report.
That's exactly right. There was a broader report that spoke to the intelligence community's assessment that Russia hacked the U.S. election, interfered in the U.S. election, and also had an intent in doing so. This two-page addendum was included in the documents for this briefing, but it was not part of that larger assessment on Russian interference.
Now, Evan Perez, let me bring you in. We know that the intelligence community and the FBI, they are still trying to vet these allegations. They found the individual, that the former British intelligence official, they found him credible and his sources credible. The allegations, they weren't so sure. So why even bring it up with President Obama or President-elect Trump?
That's right. Well, there's a couple of reasons, Jake. The reasons that they were given to do this is that the intelligence officials tell us that they included the synopsis in part to make the president-elect aware that these allegations involving him are circulating among intelligence agencies, senior members of Congress, and other government officials in Washington. Several officials with knowledge of the briefings tell CNN that the information was also included in part to demonstrate that Russia had compiled information potentially harmful to both political parties, but only released information damaging to Hillary Clinton and Democrats. Now, this synopsis was not an official part of the intelligence community case about the Russian hacks, but some officials said that it augmented the evidence that Moscow had intended to harm Clinton's campaign and to help Trump.
Fascinating. And Carl Bernstein, let me bring you in here. This information, it did not start with U.S. intelligence, and it did not start with the FBI or law enforcement. Where did it come from?
It came from a former British MI6 intelligence agent who was hired by a political opposition research firm in Washington who was doing work about Donald Trump for both Republican and Democratic candidates opposed to Trump. They were looking at Trump's business ties. They saw some questionable things about Russians, about his businesses in Russia. They in turn hired this MI6 former investigator. He then came up with additional information from his Russian sources. He was very concerned by the implications of it. He then took it to an FBI colleague that he had known in his undercover work for years. He took it to this FBI man in Rome, who turned it over to the Bureau in Washington in August. And then a former British ambassador to Russia independently was made aware of these findings, and he took the information to John McCain, Senator John McCain of Arizona, in the period just after the election, and showed it to McCain, additional findings. McCain was sufficiently disturbed by what he read to take it to FBI Director James Comey himself personally. They had a 5-minute meeting, the two men. Very little was said. McCain turned it over to him and is now awaiting what the FBI's response is to that information.
And Jim, a lot of this information in the former MI6 officials' memos has been floating around in Washington for a while. But something has changed here that now has made this more credible. First of all, the FBI has vetted the individual and his sources. And second of all, the intelligence community felt it was significant enough to include in this presentation. Does anyone else know this information?
They do. In fact, on the same day that the president-elect was briefed by the intelligence community, the top 4 congressional leaders, as well as the chairman and ranking members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, these are the so-called Gang of 8, they were also provided a summary of these memos regarding Mr. Trump, this according to law enforcement, intelligence, and administration sources. That said, the synopsis was considered so sensitive, it was not included in the classified report about Russian hacking that was more broadly distributed in Washington, but rather in an annex that was only shared at the most senior levels of government, that is, the current president, President Obama, the president-elect, Mr. Trump, and those 8 congressional leaders, Jake. So just to highlight the point there, you now have the intelligence community in possession of these documents and at least taking a look at them. You have the FBI, as Evan has reported, taking a look at them, and those senior congressional leaders. They have not established the veracity, but they are taking a look.
And Evan, we talk about the Gang of 8. Again, these are the 4 congressional leaders, Democrat, Republican, House, and Senate, and then also their counterparts in the Senate and House Intelligence Committees. This is the group that gets all the most sensitive information in the Congress. When Senator Harry Reid was a member of that group, so he's retired from Congress, but last year, he was in a briefing. And then in October, he sent a blistering open letter to FBI Director James Comey suggesting that Comey had information about contacts between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin and the Russian government or intermediaries, and he needed to come forward with that information. This is part of that?
This is part of what Harry Reid was referring to when he made those public statements. And again, he sent a public letter to Director Comey asking him that he come out with this information. And today, by the way, Jake, at an intelligence hearing on the Hill, Comey was asked again whether or not he could go into what the FBI knew about relationships within the Trump campaign and people in Russia. He said, "I can't talk about that in an open setting. I'm happy to respond to you in a classified setting." What I'm told is going on is that the FBI is investigating people who were perhaps surrogates for the Trump campaign, and whether or not there was any communication, whether there was any efforts to communicate with people who were associated with the Kremlin, with the Russian government. Again, they don't know the extent of this. This is something that has been on their radar. They've been looking at this. It is something that's a very sensitive investigation, obviously. We don't know whether it includes who it includes. We're not saying it includes Donald Trump himself. At this point, we understand that it's related to people who were surrounding the campaign. So we know that the FBI has been looking at this, and now that the election is over, now that that is out of the way, it is something that we expect that we will get a lot more attention from the Bureau.
So let's just underline this so nobody misunderstands, because we've been really working hard for several days now on getting this precise. What we know is that the top intelligence officials of this nation provided some information that they believe came from a credible source. They can't speak to the veracity of the information itself, but it suggests that there are Russians claiming that they have potentially compromising information on the president-elect.
That's right. Keep in mind, Russians claiming this. Keep in mind as well that this is not a U.S. intelligence product. It was produced by a former MI6. This is the British Foreign Intelligence Services, as opposed to the MI5, performed by a former intelligence official. And as Carl mentioned, it began as political opposition research, first for Republican opponents of Mr. Trump and then Democratic opponents. That said, he is considered in the past a credible source to Western intelligence services, and as they have vetted his Russian sources, they believe as well that there is credibility there. They have not then, though, taken the initial step, or they haven't arrived at the later conclusion that these are factual. But they are taking the step of looking at them, and also, and this is crucial, took the step of sharing these facts with the president.
And it happens in the backdrop of the fact that the FBI and the intelligence agencies are right now, the activities of the Russians in the United States is at the top of their list. They want to know exactly what they're doing, who they're talking to, what their level of involvement, their counterintelligence or the intelligence collection in the United States. All of those things is at the top of everybody's list of what their top job to find out right now is. And so that's what this is all a part of now.
And the two facts that are competing here are, what is the truth about what these Russians claim they have on the president-elect? Is there anything there? And how much communication was there between the Trump campaign and Russia? And those are still unknown as far as we know.
And we should mention that there are senators on Capitol Hill behind us here who have said that they want to look into that second point you mentioned about communications between the Trump campaign and Russians during the campaign.
Yeah, it was the subtext of the entire Senate Intelligence Committee hearing, although nobody was willing to come forward and say it.